Hello, welcome all to this session that is titled Humans and Non-Humans in a Hard Context in the track Nature and Words. This session includes three very interesting papers. First, we have Kevin Day presenting The Medium is the Environment, Digital Materialism, Digital Art, and the Climate Crisis, which discuss the environmental implication of ICT manufacturing, deployment, and usage through the theories of new and digital materialism. The second paper by Clea Waite is titled Supra-dimensional Cinema VR Case Study TesserIce. This paper presents a four-dimensional virtual reality mediascape that allows to enter the 4D space-time of glacial ice. Finally, Stella Sofokleous presents the paper Non-Human Creativity in Generative Art, Assemblage, Agency, Autonomy. This paper explores fresh insights into the ways we negotiate our ideas about non-human creativity, emphasizing the need to recast traditional notions of what it means to be an artist today. Thank you all for attending, and let's enjoy the presentations.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Kevin Day, and this talk is titled The Medium is the Environment, Digital Materialism, Digital Art, and the Climate Crisis. So as the information consultant Jerry McGovern writes, the digital trains us to treat energy as a limitless free resource. In the tech industry, the more energy we consume, the more money it may make. The tech business model is involved with the maximum exploitation of cheap energy. These cheap and free models feed the fires of the climate emergency. So this quote very quickly sets up the socio-political landscape that this talk is situated in. So contrary to the notion of immateriality and the commonplace images of the cloud, information and communication technologies from individual devices to the general infrastructure are very much grounded in the natural world, ranging from the materials needed for the production to the e-waste that is produced. Despite such entanglement with the material substrate, the environmental implications of ICT usage is rarely addressed by the tech industry, by the consumer communities, or by the field of digital art. So this talk examines the environmental implications of ubiquitous ICT manufacturing and usage using the theories of new materialism and digital materialism. Following these theoretical lenses, the talk proposes that a focus on the material is necessary, which functions as an antithesis to the abstracting act of information/data and its purported immateriality. And to explore this possibility, I'll outline a recent interactive video installation, which consists of a series of smoke machines that will emit smoke based on the gallery's data usage, combined with an animation that foregrounds the natural environment and its entanglement with the digital. So a bit more elaboration on the tech industry and digital culture's exploitation of natural resources. So McGovern's main argument is that the digital is not green. Every digital transaction has a very tangible environmental cost, but because of the social narrative that we have about the immaterial industry and the cloud, where the cost of every online transaction is trivial, supposedly, we tend to overlook this fact. So for McGovern, this has created an online culture of speed, waste, and volume. Everything from our insatiable desire and expectation of faster loading times to excessive data mining and advertising, to insufficient recycling of e-waste, and to simply expecting to be online all the time. All these activities, ranging from the creation and dissemination to the storage and operations of data, consume energy. In other words, digital culture is harmful for the environment, both in the material energy used, but also for the culture that the industry has created. So it's an accelerator of consumption. And diving deeper into specific areas within digital culture, such as internet usage, streaming media, and blockchain, this concern is echoed by various scholars. So in December 2020, Oberner et al. Reported that home internet usage after the onset of the pandemic has increased by 15 to 40%. And in 2021, Marx et al. Released a report that demonstrates streaming video online is responsible for 1% of the world's carbon emissions, which is also rising. And in particular, they noted that the presence of the J-bond paradox, where the increased energy efficiency actually leads to more energy consumption, is also supported by McGovern's argument that ICT cultivates this consumption culture with a rhetoric of speed, convenience, and supposedly cheap resources. So as they write, the availability of online video has created new consumption patterns driven by addiction design, which cancel out any energy savings. Streaming video exists within a market-driven feedback loop of infrastructural expansion and consumer demand. Marx et al. Pointed out that while the conventional environmental cost of streaming media is concerning, the carbon footprint of AI, Internet of Things, and blockchain is even more significant. According to the New York Times, as of September 2021, the mining of Bitcoin alone consumes more energy annually than the energy consumption in Finland. As the writers succinctly point out, the system wastes energy by design. It is connected to the physical world of fossil fuels, power grids, and emission, and to the climate crisis we are in today. So having highlighted some of the environmental implications of ICT operations, this paper will now pinpoint a link between computation and metaphysics, and propose digital materialism as a suitable counter to information/data against both its binary logic and the erasure of the material. So as Kay Cropper writes, instead of the ideology of Cartesian dualism in AI, where AI is narrowly defined and understood as disembodied intelligence removed from any relations to the material world, there's an urgent need to recognize that artificial intelligence is both embedded or embodied and material. And a variety of scholars have pointed out this alignment between the metaphysical assumption of this knowing subject that is separate from and therefore superior to the world of knowing objects, and this binary logic of information. As Stephen Wilson writes, by its very nature, digital representation requires the breaking apart of phenomena and the representations by symbolic bits. So under this epistemic model of the digital, such representations create the conditions for knowing, where a subject comes to know the world through database representations that consist of bits. In this ontoepistemology, which assumes worldly phenomena can be represented as information for the rational and detached knowing subject, this is an information-based way of knowing. And for the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, whose work is very critical of AI's representational claims, such information-based way of knowing is the legacy of the Cartesian epistemological model, one that privileges the rational mind in its quest to abstract the world into facts and principles. So instead, he insists that these representational claims cannot account for the everyday phenomena and embedded context of the world. In drawing from Heidegger, he questions this conceptualization where the subject is a floating mind and is somehow detached from the world while trying to make sense of it. So against the notion that everything can be encoded, David Columbia similarly writes that we are material beings embedded in the physical world with the historical context of our experiences. Thought, language, self may emerge from those physical materialities. So through this model of agential realism, the new materialist philosopher Karen Barad proposes an onto-epistemology that confounds the distinction between culture and nature, human and non-human, negating this Cartesian representational model where methods of representations are assumed to represent the objects of the world. So Barad proposes instead a performative model of looking at how fluid agents are always entangled and interact with one another, both human and non-human. So they argue that knowing does not come from standing at a distance and representing, but from a direct material engagement with the world. In fact, even theorizing must be understood as an embodied practice. So in doing so, Barad also eschews the distinctions between theory and practice, words and things, discourse and materials, subject and object. In taking the discussion into the digital landscape, Baruch Ghalib's theorization of digital materialism combines the problem of AI and its decontextualization, as outlined by Hubert Dreyfus, with this new materialist teaching of Karen Barad. So as he writes, data is not immaterial. There is no cloud, only someone else's computer. So against the myth of the cloud, which contributes to an emancipatory and utopian rhetoric of digital media, he insists on the literal matter needed for the process of fabrication and operation, and the often overlooked human resources needed to sustain the tech industry. Computational devices are material all the way through, from the raw metals and the chemical processes of the chips to the polymers and the pixels and the electric processes. In addition, we need to consider the underwater internet cables that are affecting marine life, the effect of the mining industry, the energy costs of data farms, the e-waste, and also the materiality of the unpaid laborers. So these material layers stand in distinction to the myth that information is immaterial, therefore the cost of doing business is next to none, which positions digital media to be inherently predisposed to be more egalitarian and democratic. The concept of digital materialism emphasizes this political relationship between the supremacy of informatics and the subjugated materiality that the world is actually embedded in. So to explore digital materialism in digital art necessitates not just this acknowledgement that code and information are also materials, but it is also a need to examine the material conditions that give rise to and sustain digital media assemblages. If the digital is linked with the metaphysical abstraction that unethically separates the mind and body, discourse and matter, humans and non-humans, including the environment, then a focus on the overlooked materiality of the world, especially within ICT industries, offers a potent counter. So with the intention of foregrounding the overlooked materiality of ICT assemblages, this final section of the talk will look at a data-driven video installation that I'm currently working on. So examining the intersection of ICT, the human body, and the natural environment, the project, titled The Medium is the Environment, is an interactive installation that consists of two parts. First, a downward video projection of an animation, and two, a series of smoke machines programmed to release a certain amount of smoke depending on the data usage of the gallery space. And the animation itself consists of several scenes, such as the scanning and measuring of land, floating screens becoming environmental, breathing interfaces, clouds emerging from the footage of semiconductor manufacturing, and floating screens emerging out of the Katanga mines in the Congo. And in general, a merging of the digital, the human, and the environmental. In doing so, the animation foregrounds ICT assemblage's global footprint and tackles their continued exploitation and subjugation of the material, such as the land, environment, and nature. In addition, smoke machines will be placed around the projection, intermittently releasing smoke depending on one's data usage, implicating both the gallery space as well as the viewers within the system, The project focuses on the environmental impact our digitized lives are having on the planet. So focusing on the materiality of something supposedly immaterial. The two components of the project, namely the animation and the smoke machines, are designed to link our digital lives with the very material presence of smoke, which functions as a proxy of the ICT industry's carbon emission. What is highlighted are the marginalized stakeholders within the infrastructure industry of ICT, specifically the exploited natural resources and the human resources. As Cropper writes, the operations of AI in the computation industry in general exert their forces through abstraction and extraction, abstracting away the material conditions of their making while extracting more information and resources from those least able to resist. Materiality is simultaneously that which is erased and that which is exploited. So this talk has outlined the current and urgent issues of the environmental footprint of a variety of components within the ICT industry, under this overall rhetoric of speed, volume, and waste, an insatiable encoding apparatus that leverages the myth of immateriality. So with the intention of creating socially engaged digital art practices, and this paper articulates that there's a need for digital art to tackle the issue of ICT assemblages and their contributions to the climate crisis. So to that end, I propose the scholarship of digital materialism as a response to the environmental issues above, but also to this theoretical link between the digital and the ontological model of the metaphysical subject versus a world of objects. So this project noted above is an initial attempt at developing an artwork informed by digital materialism, with the aim of resisting this information-based way of knowing through both its content and form. With its emphasis on an alternative ontological and epistemological model, I suggest that digital materialism offers a productive theoretical lens and counter tactic for digital art to tackle the climate crisis by foregrounding the overlooked materialities of the world. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clea T. Waite. I am an intermedia scientist, artist, and experimental filmmaker. My work examines the material poetics emerging at the intersection of art, science, and technology. My immersive cinematic works engage embodied perception, dynamic composition, and central interfaces centered on themes of climate change, astronomy, particle physics, history, feminism, and popular culture. Physical reality can be understood as a hypervolume of past and future matter extending along the limitless axis of time into a higher dimension of space, beyond our sensory perception. This present moment is a continually shifting, metamorphosing shadow of this hypervolume as it passes through our three-dimensional space. Visible evidence of this space-time polytope is our perception of changing states of matter over time, such as rusting objects, geological strata, coral reefs, or melting ice caps. Contemporary Western culture exists in the metadimensions of a redefined world, full of strange data vistas that surround us in manifold crystalline perspectives. The supra-dimensional approach to composition presented here, grounded in geometry, is an unfolding, enfolding, evolving continuum that affords an artistic expression of reality more closely aligned to the mechanics of the post-Newtonian universe as we currently understand it. The Earth's cryosphere, the frozen poles, is a four-dimensional space-time container of atmospheric history. Ice cores drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica provide a physical timeline 800,000 years back into the history of Earth's climate. Glaciers encapsulate a hyperspace of environmental time. This paper addresses the confluence of higher dimensional spaces with immersive cinema and proposes the notion of a supra-dimensional cinema. The creative precedent for our novel approach to cinematic structure builds on the historical interactions between new discoveries in mathematics and physics at the turn of the last century and the artistic avant-garde of the same era. Finally, we will look at how the poetics of hyperspace can be harnessed to depict the multidimensional data of climate change, making it emotionally accessible in a series of immersive cinema artworks, in particular the VR work in progress, TesserIce. Reality as observed in common experience has three directions in it: up-down, side-to-side, and forward-back. The necessity for three dimensions of space can be traced back to Aristotle, where there is already a notion of three space, the same Euclidean space used by René Descartes and the great 17th century physicist of classical mechanics, Isaac Newton, to represent the familiar three-dimensional macroscopic world we are accustomed to from daily observation. This classical Cartesian three-space began to be challenged in the late 19th century. Non-Euclidean geometry was discovered in the early 19th century by Carl Friedrich Gauss and solidified in the 1870s, introducing a new notion of hyperbolic geometry accompanied by a variable curved perspective. Late 19th century Western culture was furthermore fascinated with the concept of n-dimensional geometry, hyperspace, and the idea of a fourth dimension. The four-dimensional cube, the hypercube, or tesseract, was introduced at this time. Art historian Linda Dalrymple Henderson has established how the profound mathematical discovery of non-Euclidean geometry resonated with creative artists and intellectuals, influencing the arts, literature, and the cultural psyche, in particular the avant-garde. Turn-of-the-century scientific discoveries furthermore instigated a break with the classical logic of Euclidean Newtonian space and time that resulted in a cultural embrace of the non-visible, relativistic ambiguity, and indeterminacy. The lingering aesthetic constructs invented by the artistic movements that evolved from this shift share critical concerns with the supra-dimensional approach to immersive cinema discussed in this paper. With supra-dimensional cinema, we endeavor to conjure a post-Newtonian space-time by breaking with the cinematic linearity, single-point perspective, and spatiotemporal continuity of standard cinema. Mathematician W.I. Stringham attempted the first drawings of supradimensional hypersolid sections in 1880 by calculating perspective projections from 4 space into 3. His drawings are shaded shadows of shadows, 2 true dimensions of spatial information lost in the rendering. In 1903, the mathematician Esprit Jouffret described the method for projecting a geometric configuration of n dimensions onto a space of n-1 dimensions, for example, 4 dimensions onto 3. Architect and designer Claude Fayette Bragdon played a key role in popularizing the 4th dimension at the turn of the 20th century. Bragdon proposed that our ability to perceive the 4th dimension manifests as time. Time appears as changes of state to immobile objects as the 4-dimensional space-time form moves progressively through the 3-space sliver that is the object's present. Space is transposed into time, or time into space. It was Charles Howard Hinton who coined the term tesseract in 1904 to describe a 4-dimensional cube or hypercube. Hinton used color to represent an additional dimension of information in his illustrations of hypercubes. Hinton, like Bragdon, placed a great emphasis on the need for a time-based experience, on motion, as requisite for comprehending an object of n+ dimensions from within the limitations of an n-dimensional space. The tesseract, as perceived from 3 space, has an inherently cinematic nature. The invention of cinema has made it possible to aid in the perception of space, the ability to see around the object using time. In 1962, computer scientist Michael Knoll at Bell Labs was able to realize a dream of a tesseract viewable in motion, creating the first stereoscopic computer-animated film of a rotating hypercube. Visualizing 4-dimensional structures from the confines of our 3-dimensional space is a question that continually challenges mathematicians and artists. Most solutions, like Knoll's animation, have envisioned these structures from a distance, looking at them rather than experiencing them from within. Now, the three-dimensional space and navigability of virtual reality presents an expanded information space uniquely positioned to model and visualize higher dimensions. It allows the mathematical construction of a 4D architecture which the participant can enter to experience the shifting space-time shadows of a tesseract from within. Cinema, because it is both a spatial and a time-based medium, has a unique capacity to assimilate new, evolving spatiotemporal relationships in the arts and sciences, and to structure narrative according to a non-classical notion of causality. The history of cinema has challenged the representation of the irreversible and unidirectional relationship between cause and effect, the calling card of classical Newtonian physics, nearly since its inception. Standard three-dimensional film space, the two-dimensional image plane, and the timeline dimension is a closed system. The passage through narrative space is strictly ocular, linear, deterministic, and passive. In contrast, the four-dimensional film space described here is spatial, relativistic, ambiguous, non-deterministic, and active. Within this space, perspective is a function of the viewer's point of view. Narrative, too, is dependent on the orientation of the viewer. The narrative axis is nonlinear and non-causal. Sequential linearity is replaced by spatial simultaneity. Navigation through narrative space engages multiple aspects of physical perception and occupies a liminal space between the real and the virtual. Somatic montage is a spatial narrative approach to the four dimensions of immersive cinema, constructed according to a non-classical notion of space-time. Motion is essential for comprehending a four-dimensional object from three-dimensional space. We use the notion of the cinematic tesseract to formally explore immersive cinema as hyperspace. We create a spatiotemporal flow structure that explodes the screen into an architectonic immersive cinema. A hypermediascape is formed whose polyperspectival space is deciphered as the embodied navigation of the beholder, guided by the syntax of a somatic montage. Our approach involves considering narrative as both time and space, faceted into simultaneous streams distributed in the cinematic architecture. No narrative hierarchy, no explicit viewing direction or pathway dominates the flow. Instead, the narrative is composed as an open work, a work in movement in the sense advanced by philosopher Umberto Eco. Eco described the open work as a work of art stripped of necessary and foreseeable conclusions. The open work is a prepared field of possibilities for the unpredictable performance of the beholder. Montage, like poetry, manifests the same idiom of fragmentation, juxtaposition, and association. The poetic language of supra-dimensional cinema is an unfolding, enfolding, evolving continuum that affords an expression of reality more closely aligned to the post-Newtonian mechanics of the universe as we currently understand them. With somatic montage, we aim to reinstate an explicit connection to a poetic space, an enfolding of embodiment and participation within the spatiotemporal experience of the cinematic. The Ice Time series is a document of our unique moment in glacial space-time. This series of works realizes hyperdimensional cinematic spaces that transform the audience's subjective perception of time. The works present non-human scales of time, in particular the time scales of glacial ice, as an experience of the accelerating temporal reality of climate change. TesserIce, part of the Ice Time series, is a four-dimensional virtual reality mediascape that allows one to enter the space-time of glacial ice. Entering a 4D hypercube creates an individual experience of the space-time effects of climate change on the ice. TesserIce brings human perception into the reality of glaciers, creating an immersive embodied experience of the time, scale, causes, and effects of climate change on the ice. In the artwork, the participant enters a crystalline tesseract architecture. Within this architecture, different scales, forms, speeds, and sounds of ice filmed in the cryosphere compose the space. The participants' movements propel them along the four spatial axes of this tesseract, X, Y, Z, W, between different cube rooms, unfolding uncharted vistas, juxtapositions, and timeframes. Filmed during an expedition to Western Greenland, the images of TesserIce present hyperrealistic, magnified views of ice taken at all scales, from the microscopic to the planetary. The dimension of time within the glaciers is perceived as the changing states of the ice. Time expands and contracts. The body of the beholder is enfolded, collapsing its sensory distance to the ice. In TesserIce, the viewer is free to walk through walls, floors, ceilings, and time within the four-dimensional space. Their movements propel them through hyperdimensions along the four axes of this tesseract. One of our inspirations for this architecture comes from the 1941 short story by Robert A. Heinlein, And He Built a Crooked House. It's about a four-dimensional architecture that continually wraps back on itself infinitely. Viewing back into the third dimension from the four space of the tesseract, the head and the tail of an object are coextensive. Neither inside and outside nor top and bottom as we know them are distinguishable, and linear perspective is fractured into crystalline polyperspectival facets or curved into a non-Euclidean space of relativistic proximities. Within cinematic hyperspace, action is as pervasive as sound. The acoustic soundscape plays an essential role in the sensory environment of the TesserIce experience. For TesserIce, we have recreated a physical 9.1 surround sound mix in the Unity VR environment and experimented with how this immersive soundscape behaves in a four-dimensional navigable space. The combined three-dimensional stereoscopic space and embodied navigability of virtual reality foster a supra-dimensional perceptive space, providing four and more dimensions of representation. They provide an opportunity to experience a four-dimensional shifting landscape and acoustic cinematic environment from within the fourth dimension. VR is uniquely positioned to visualize hyperspace as a mathematical construct in which the participant can experience four dimensions. The TesserIce VR experience constructs the tesseract as an embodied cinema poem, a hyperspace of spatialized meaning and navigable time, enacting the strange data vistas that surround us in manifold perspectives, the meta-dimensions of our contemporary disembodied data world. TesserIce constructs a tesseract of polar ice in time as spatial poetics. Participants propel themselves through the hyperdimensions of this tesseract, unfolding uncharted vistas, juxtapositions, and timeframes, the space-time of Earth's polar ice. The artwork examines our culture's altering perceptions of space and time, the deep time of Earth's environment, by using polar ice to create a unique experience of climate change. To express many thanks to my collaborators on the TesserIce project, Jared Christopher Kelly, Max Orozco, Caleb Foss, and Angelica von Chamier. The Icetime series and TesserIce were made possible by generous support from the organizers listed on the page here and by our collaborating scientists also listed. Finally, thank you to the ISEA organizers, and thank you for your time and attention.
Non-human creativity in generative art beyond the anthropocentric paradigm. In recent decades, within the theory of art discourse, there is an attempt to understand and define an emerging trend of artistic production which derives from the ability of generative systems and algorithms to express themselves artistically with a certain degree of autonomy. The debate over the potentially autonomous artistic production of a non-human agent is a complicated one, partly because it brings back the modernistic concern that the machine will displace the artist from the creative process, leading to a technological dystopia. Artificial creativity can hardly be explained through the rigid behaviors of algorithms, so it is often approached through the interpretation schemes we have created to explain human creativity. However, the inexperience of our human species in comprehending creative others and the fear of losing our most human quality constitute a serious setback for an impartial understanding of the creativity of non-human agents. The analysis attempts to question the exegesis of the non-human creativity of generative art through the anthropocentric paradigm. In doing so, non-human creative systems are approached as an ontological otherness, as agents per se. The first part of this paper approaches examples which demonstrate how human and non-human creative agents operate as an assemblage in order to jointly explore new artistic possibilities. The second part highlights the less rigid manifestation of the behavior of the algorithms using the artificial system of creating art and explores whether such approach can function as a getaway to an ontological exploration of the non-human creativity. Examples of art creation system date back to 1968 when the artist Harold Cohen created Aaron, a machine he designed and trained to imitate his own artistic style. In the 5 decades of his collaboration with the artist, Aaron gradually went from creating simple black and white representational forms to more complex color works that resemble those of Cohen. Although any idea had to be coded and fed into the system, the program could compose an almost infinite numbers of distinct works on its own. Aaron's ability to make decisions was made possible through Cohen's choice to install a random number generator at the heart of the program. Cohen said that the relationship he had developed with Aaron was similar to that of the Renaissance artist with his assistant in the studio. However, as it is shown in this quote, within the time course, his relationship with his system seemed to have taken the form of an assemblage, with Aaron exploring and pointing out to the artist new manifestations of the latter's artistic style. In 2005, Simon Colton, with a team of scientists at Imperial College of London, developed an artist machine called the Painting Fool. According to their website, they started the creation of the machine in order to investigate whether an artificial system can be described as creative artist in its own right. For this reason, Painting Fool does not copy the style of a pre-existing visual style or artist, but creates works through its interaction with the stimuli of its environment. One of the Painting Fool's first work was a composition of portraits of visitors of the gallery where the system was on display. Colton, wanting to avoid random number generator, decided that the current mode which would inspire the creation of a portrait will be activated in the machine based on the daily news presented in the press. Painting Fool therefore scanned daily articles from The Guardian and modified its feeling according to how positive or negative were the news of the day. In the field of artificial neural networks in artistic production, the recent work of artist and researcher Tyka is notable. One of the most recent series of his work is called Portraits of Fantastic People and concerns the training of neural system in the composition of human faces that never existed. To achieve photorealistic oil in canvas-like portraits, thousands of photos of people were uploaded from Flirk, which were then imported into a program called GAN. As it is shown from the quote, here are some examples of these photorealistic portraits. As it is shown from the quote shown here, GANs work using 2 neural networks that play an adversarial game. At first glance, the artist's generative competitive networks are understood as a closed system of machines, a dialogue between 2 non-human agents. However, the way the 2 GANs work with one trying to fool the other allows the future replacement of one of the 2 with a human. Also, the dialogue of artificial and natural in this case concerns the training of recognition of human patterns by the networks. Moving on, Lionel Moura used artificial system inspired by swarm intelligence to create to create his robot art. This system used innovative algorithmic methods that are governed by a collective form of self-organization. His work was presented at the exhibition A Machine for Creating in the catalog entitled Artists and Robots in 2018. Moura created and programmed small robots which move on a large piece of paper, leaving color lines on their way, and eventually created an abstract composition. These systems have satisfactory understanding of the environment in which they operate and are equipped with a small brain which is based on algorithms governed by simple rules. The paths that Artbots follow on their white surface are not pre-designed, and so the end result is due to both some form of randomness in terms of the initial condition of their movements and the interaction between them. The second section, the more philosophical section, is called Ontology of the Algorithms of Generative Art. And it tries to argue that what is missing from the discussion on the nature of algorithms is an understanding of their new ontology. As Hill quotes here, neither the articulation of an algorithm nor the dynamic process constitute the algorithm itself. Although the interaction with the artists and the programmers is essential for the organization of the systems, the algorithm remains an autonomous entity. The autonomy of an algorithm system is related to its ability to exist independently of the data on which it operates and the program that encodes it. It is also related to their adaptability, their ability to recognize structural features of reality, locating patterns in their data space and adapting their functions accordingly. As Montfort mentions, code is not purely abstract and mathematical. It has significant social, political, and aesthetic dimensions, often correlated with the environment in which the code itself operates. Also, algorithm is inherently performative. As Kitchen points out, as well as being heterogeneous and embedded, algorithms are rarely fixed in forms, and their work in practice unfolds in multifarious ways. As such, algorithms need to be recognized as being ontogenetic, performative, and contingent. That is, they are never fixed in nature, but are emergent and constantly unfolding. In some cases, algorithms and their code incarnations are refined, redesigned, extended, and corrected by repeating through different versions. The originality that governs the artist's creation of systems, although fed in them through programming, is not predictable or controlled by the programmers. The performative actions of an algorithm are neither intentional nor explicit, but remain open to error, with the transition from one stage to another not always being deterministic. This non-causal dimension of the algorithms is not identified with the randomness that governs stochastic algorithms, but rather with the complexity of an algorithmic assemblage. And to conclude on the arguments about whether or not a system can be considered as creative, I quote here a famous theory of Turing, that the repetitive nature of the algorithms is linked also to their ability to inductive reasoning. So the algorithm modifies its actions each time it is executed. So in a way, it learns by itself. To conclude with, this whole section wants to argue that overcoming the limitation of a creative artificial system occurs from within the system itself, and it's intervened with the very structure of the algorithms that constitute them. So the general conclusion, I put some quotes here. This is from Lionel Moura, his symbiotic manifesto. Art produced by autonomous robots cannot be seen as a mere tool or device for human predetermined aesthetical purpose, although it may constitute a singular aesthetical experience. The unmanned characteristic of such a kind of art must be translated in the definitive overcoming of the anthropocentric prejudice that still dominates Western thought. In short, A true robotic art must be the matter of robots themselves. Also, Alison Pease and Simon Colton, the creators of the painting Full, write in a paper that humans and machines have different strengths, and instead of trying to squeeze machines into a way of thinking that is human, we should aim to develop computer systems that make the most of their power. And I also added a quote from Wittgenstein, mentioning that if a lion could speak, we could not understand him, pointing out to the open approach we need to have in order to be able to understand different forms of creativity. The human species has so far progressed with an almost undisputed confidence against the machine, believing that it possesses some features that no algorithmic system would be able to emulate. The shift that the generative art brings to the traditional shift of artistic production is understood as the formation and emergence of a new otherness. The acceptance of other agents to be creative requires awareness and self-knowledge of our own creativity, a quality that we think of as a conditio humana, something that defines us as human beings, but which still remains essentially unknown to us. Thank you so much. This was my presentation. I will be open to questions. I'm looking forward to hear your feedback. And thank you also to the conference for including me to this event. Thank you.